Hello and welcome to this video where I'm going to be exploring whether or not A Christmas Carol is an anti-Semitic text. There are lots of different interpretations of A Christmas Carol that we'll be going through in this video, and I think it's just important to point out that there are lots of valid interpretations and there's lots of valid evidence that you can use for this. There's not necessarily one correct answer or one incorrect answer, but if you're hoping to have a conceptualized response, you need to make a decision about what you think. Now, I often think that our actual, meaning within texts are brought to it by us as the reader, as opposed to just what the writer intends. And that's, what Roland Barthes talked about as readerly or writerly texts. And so really, I think the great thing about Christmas Carol is that you can make your decision based on the range of evidence of what you think and lead your line of argument in your analytical responses down that path. So, is it or isn't it an anti-Semitic text? Well, there are multiple interpretations of A Christmas Carol. Some people have categorized it as something like a humanist or a secular parable, meaning a parable being a moral story, and secular meaning non-religious. So that it still has a moral undertone to it, but that's one about being a good person and not one of religion. Some people have argued that it's actually a Christian conversion story, so it's the idea of once Scrooge takes on these Christian traits, he therefore becomes a better, more well-rounded individual. Perhaps Dickens's purpose here is to try and encourage people to take on the Christian faith. Of course, there are elements of it being a Gothic ghost story, and even when Dickens is trying to subvert some of those tropes of Gothic genre, we can still see it firmly rooted in there. We have Marley, who acts as a revenant. We've got the elements of obscurity through the fog and Scrooge's ignorance, and also some of those like typical characteristics of a ghost story, ghosts being one of them, of course, and there are four. Some people have argued that it's an anti-capitalist polemic, and actually it's more therefore political rather than moral, and it is trying to encourage the Victorian readers to really try and to reject the recent poor laws and try and be more supportive of the most deprived and destitute within Victorian society. It does have elements of a psychological thriller, but beyond that, people have also questioned it for its anti-Semitic tropes. And actually, they've questioned other works by Dickens. So I think probably one of the most famous examples of what some people might perceive to be an anti-Semitic portrayal of a character is the representation of the character Fagin in Oliver Twist. Okay, so I think we need to start by thinking about what Dickens believed. So he had really firm Christian beliefs and values. He actually wrote a handwritten manuscript called The Life of Our Lord, which recounts the story of the New Testament, and he worked on it for 3 years. His idea behind it was to give it to his children. And one of the things that he said to his younger son was that he believed that the New Testament was the best that ever was or ever will be known in the world. And I now most solemnly impress upon you the beauty of the Christian religion as it came from Christ himself. So to him, the New Testament particularly was very important. Now, Dickens was a follower of utilitarianism, which means that, not to be confused with utilitarianism, but it's basically a Christian theological movement which was named for its belief that God in Christianity is one person as opposed to the Trinity. So some people have argued in the past that they feel that the ghosts may represent the Holy Trinity. However, other literary criticism has actually supposed that because he was a utilitarian and they were that was what he followed, it's probably unlikely that that was his intention. And actually there's probably more of an intention there of him trying to represent amongst them some of the pagan Christian ideals, the pagan festivals of Christmas, some of the Christian ideals, and mix them up together to show that Christmas is a time of giving and being supportive of others and benevolence. Okay, so the next thing that we can question is whether we think Scrooge is Jewish or not. So to be anti-Semitic, it needs to be representing Judaism in a negative light. So there are some pieces of evidence to suggest that. So Ebenezer Scrooge is a moneylender who doesn't celebrate Christmas. Ebenezer is also a Hebrew word deriving from the phrase Eben Hazer, meaning stone of the help. And Jacob Marley as well, his first name, Jacob, is one of the Jewish forefathers, and his Hebrew family name meaning, it is bitter to me. So there are elements there of Judaism in their names. And Scrooge not only doesn't observe Christmas festivities, but more than that, he hates Christmas. He is also presented as miserly, and he's described in the opening as having a pointed nose, which are all caricatures, negative caricatures of Jewish people of the time. So, I mean, we could argue that this is a negative portrayal of a Jewish person. Of course, it is only when he accepts Christian values into his life and into his heart that he's therefore seen to be happy and more content. So that's why some people might argue that it could be perceived as a conversion story. But other people have argued that his name could merely be seen as a contrast between the Old and the New Testament, because the Old Testament features names such as Ebenezer and Jacob, whereas the New Testament features names such as Martha, and they are the names that we see obviously in the Cratchit family. And therefore, it could be more about Dickens talking about the importance of the New Testament, which is something that he believed in, and this idea of unity, of there being one God. So I think it's also important to look at the difference between salvation and redemption. Now, Dickens wasn't Catholic, and he did believe in the New Testament particularly. But this idea of salvation and redemption are actually quite important concepts within the novel, and they're also quite important concepts in the Catholic faith. But there are two key differences between the two. So Jesus' sacrificial death on the cross is the act of redemption that forgave us from our sins and spared us from a life of eternal damnation. And redemption is just the first step of that salvation and the first part of our life as a child of God within the Catholic faith. So redemption, for Catholics, is defined as the process of restoring man from the bondage of sin to the liberty of the children of God through the satisfactions and merits of Christ. And actually, when we go to the end of the novella and we see that Scrooge is described as very childlike, he's laughing, he's giddy as a schoolboy, and perhaps that is an example of his redemption, the fact that he has become returned to the children of God. But our lives as children of God, according to the Catholic faith, does not begin and end in redemption. So after we are redeemed from our sins and reconciled with God, they begin the process of salvation. So it's the idea, so actually you could argue that the end of this novella ends with his redemption, but perhaps not his salvation. And that again is open to interpretation. So we also need to think about whether there are positive or negative representations, and also alternative interpretations. So it could be seen as a story of redemption. Scrooge is redeemed once he embraces those Christian values, and he is avoided when he embodies those Jewish characteristics. So it could be a conscious construct, or it could be something that we're reading into it. So William Melton, writing in the Riverfront Times of St. Louis, Missouri, he asked rhetorically, are we the only ones who've noticed that this widely accepted, celebrated piece of literature is actually wildly anti-Semitic? We're dealing with a cold, greedy Jewish banker sporting a pointed nose. In the end, the miserly Jewish banker opens his heart to the Spirit of Christ, and then and only then is he transformed into a loving human being. Scrooge done got himself saved. So that's one interpretation there, a more contemporary interpretation. But there are some other views. Some people argue that it's a humanist novel and it's actually more about community. I would be more inclined to see it as what Paul B. Davis argues is a social gospel, because he says it appears secular on one level, therefore not being religious and about humanity and being humanist, but it's actually underpinned with the Christian belief of working together to support the poor. And Joshua Taft describes it as an undogmatic view of Christianity. So therefore, it does show Christianity, but it's not really, Dickens is not unapologetically opinionated. He's not trying to show that there is only one viewpoint. He's open to different ideas. It could also be about the message of one of the dangers of losing your connection with family. And this is actually a message that is important to lots of faiths, including Judaism. And it could also be one about the importance of philanthropy, which again is something that is deeply rooted within Jewish tradition. So in the Times of Israel, Barbara Aiello called Dickens' novella a slim volume that celebrated kindness, charity and human transformation, ideals that parents the world over hope to instill in their children, ideals that have deep roots in Jewish tradition. Or, as Samantha Nelson put it in Escapist magazine last year, there's no Santa, no reindeer, and certainly no reference to the baby Jesus. It's a weird ghost story with a humanist moral. So we can see lots of alternative interpretations there, although you could argue that there are references to Jesus through the representations of Tiny Tim, who suffers for our sins like Jesus did. So, as I've said, it's entirely up to you what you think about it, but you need to have a clear viewpoint and a clear argument in your responses and take on, all these alternative interpretations. Whilst you need your own clear line of argument, when we encounter certain individual quotations, it's important for you to really look at alternatives. One person might argue this, one person might argue that. If you can memorise some of these quotes, so for example, Paul Davis arguing that it's a social gospel, or Joshua Taft arguing that it's an undogmatic view of Christianity, this is really going to add validity to your argument and really firmly place you there in grade 9.